So with Unreal Engine 5.5 officially released, let's go ahead and talk about the render settings that I use for a lot of my personal and commercial work using Unreal Engine and Unreal Engine 5.5. Before we get started, I want to share with you my mindset about rendering in Unreal, and it is typically a belief that what you see is what you get. Whatever your viewport looks like, you need to make sure that you have good looking assets, lighting, textures, materials, all the fun bells and whistles, because there is no render setting that will actually make your render significantly better than what you see in your viewport. Yes, you can add a little bit more samples. Yes, you can do some stuff in post, but most of the time in Unreal, just think what you see is what you get, and that will help save you a lot of time. And if your render is not giving you the good feels that your artwork is worth posting on the internet, it might be worth going to relight, retexture, remake the model, etc. So with that out of the way, we're in Unreal Engine and we're going to render this grenade that I made inspired by Arcane Season 2. I like the character Jinx, even though she's not my main. I typically play Vi or Akali or someone like that. Okay, jokes aside, we are in Unreal Engine, and the most important thing you need to render your sequence is a level sequence. So if you're not there, let's go ahead and right click in the empty space of our content browser. We're going to go up to cinematics and level sequence. You can also go up to your level sequence little clapboard up here and click add level sequence and be like, hey, where do you want to save our level sequence? I'm not going to do that because I already have a little folder right here and I have our demo for our tutorial today. Now, this is my level sequence, but if you need to render something completely fresh, and this is kind of like what your level sequence look like, we can move around in our scene. We can see that we have our little grenade, and if I go ahead and play this back, it's kind of doing this little floaty thing. If I were to render this now, it's not going to work because we need to make sure that we have a camera in our project. So you can either click this button right here, you can go up to the three hamburger lines and go to create camera actor, add a cine camera actor, or just make a camera and add it to your level, animate it, set it up, compose it, etc. I have a camera in my outliner up here. I'm going to click and drag and put this into my level sequencer, and we can see here that it generates this thing called a camera cut track. A camera cut track is basically telling Unreal what camera do we want to render at a certain point based on our frames. Now what you're looking at down here in your level sequencer is your in and out point, the green and the red, and if you don't see that, you can just go ahead and right click and hit start, set end time, set start time, etc. I'm going to undo that because I wanted to render from frame 0, and if I had multiple cameras in my shot, I could go ahead and change the in and out point of my cameras here, but we're just going to make sure that we're rendering our in and out. And one thing I always like to do is just give myself a little extra handles just so I don't accidentally misrender a frame. So I have my in and out point set, and my camera cut is set just beyond my in and out. Just a little video editing tip. All right, we're ready to render our shot. Let's go ahead and click the clapboard here, and it's going to give us our movie render queue. This is basically saying what render sequence or what level sequence are we going to render, what sequence is going to be shown right here, and the level that sequencer is associated with is also going to be right here. If you're working in a large project with multiple levels, you may need to double check this. But by default, if you're just getting started, you shouldn't have to change anything here. We're going to go to our settings and our unsaved config. When we click this, this is going to be the default settings out of Unreal. And I use the default a lot of the time for previews for my personal work and client work. And what we can do here is go to our output directory, go to our output directory here with these three lines, find a folder that we want to save this. I'll just set this into this predetermined folder, hit select folder. I can set my output resolution. We'll just keep this at 1920 by 1080. And if you need to do higher res content, I recommend at most 4K. We can talk about higher res stuff in another tutorial, but 1920 by 1080 is going to be fine 95% of the time. We don't need to change our deferred rendering, but this is basically saying we're going to render our viewport and what we see is what we get. And then we're going to render a JPEG sequence that we can see right here. So I'll go ahead and hit accept, go to my movie render queue, hit render local, and your movie render queue is going to pop up and you're going to see this preview. It's basically saying how many frames are we rendering. This is rendering super fast because we're not adding extra samples to our render. So this will be done in 8 seconds.
A few moments later.
So with that done, we can go ahead and preview that, and I'd say it looks fine. It looks pretty good. You tell me what you think, but this is something that I will use for previews to my clients and previews for my own work if I need to do more stuff in post later. Now, if I want to do something that is ready to deliver to clients, post on Instagram, TikTok, etc., I will go to my settings and I will change a couple things. The first is I'm going to go to my JPEG sequence and I will delete that. I will go to my settings and I'll add a PNG sequence. This is just an old habit that dies hard as a motion designer and filmmaker. I just like my PNG sequences. I will then go to my settings and I will add my game overrides. Now, if you're working on a less powerful graphics card, what this is basically doing is saying, hey, however the viewport looks from a quality standpoint, as in we go to our settings and we go to our engine scalability settings, we can see that I have a pretty decent computer, so it's already set to cinematic, but your computer might not be as powerful, so it may default to a lower number, or you may have set this already. But if you enable your game overrides in your movie render queue render settings, it's just going to force cinematic settings. Now, depending on the quality of your graphics card, this may take significantly longer or it might be completely fine. So I always add my game overrides. This is just a basic getting started point. I will also go to my settings and go to my anti-aliasing, and I will add anti-aliasing to basically increase the sample count of my render. And this will help with things like motion blur, pre-cooking the engine for particles or groom hair, basically. And by default, I will keep my spatial sample count at 1, the default, and then I will set my temporal sample count to 8. And then I will set my override anti-aliasing to on, and I will make sure that the anti-aliasing mode is set to none. Now, I always select render warm-up frames, and then I will set my render warm-up count to 48 and my engine warm-up count to 48. And this is basically cooking the engine or preloading the engine for 48 frames, just so that it can basically cook extra lighting and make sure that there's no weird flickery jaggies for lighting, particles, Niagara, etc. 48 is a good starting point. You may want to bump this up to 240 or 10 seconds. Basically, whatever your frame rate is and then how many seconds you want it to render. So how many seconds times your frame rate. I'm typically good with this, so I'll go to my output directory, set my new folder to the render settings basic. I just have this folder right here, pre-made, hit accept, hit render, and this will take 8 times longer. When you go ahead and look at your movie pipeline render, we can see here that it's creating subsamples or subframes, and then it generates the frame for our render. So this is going to take about a minute and 30 seconds, so we'll just let this finish, and then we'll show you my more advanced render settings.
2,000 years later.
Alright, basic render settings out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about the more advanced render settings. Let's go ahead and hit the clapboard and go to our unsaved config for our render, and we're going to delete the JPEG sequence. First things first, we're going to go ahead and go to our settings and add an EXR sequence, and we're going to set the compression to DWA or DWAP. And the reason why we do that is the file size is going to be a lot more manageable when it comes to our render. If you need to do more advanced things like crypto mats, compositing, etc., I recommend keeping it on PIS, but the file sizes will be significantly larger, so just keep that in mind. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my anti-aliasing. I'll set the spatial count to 1, set the temporal to 8, override, turned on, anti-aliasing method to none. I will render my warm-up frames here, render warm-up count to 48 and 48, and if you're doing more advanced things like particles, groom, hair, etc., set this to 240. That's a good starting point. After our anti-aliasing sets are made, we can go ahead and go to our settings and turn on our game overrides. We don't need to change anything here. This is just brute forcing cinematic quality settings. Go to our settings. Now, the most important thing for your renders in Unreal is going to be your color output if you're using EXRs. And the reason why is because EXRs are rendered as a linear image. A linear image is basically some more advanced color space, color science things that is way beyond my pay grade. But long story short, EXRs are going to be in linear. So when we render with EXRs, make sure that we have a color output, and by default, just disable the tone curve. Now, the reason why your color output is important is because we want to make sure that our Unreal Engine viewport matches exactly what we want to see in our post-processing software. So what I do recommend you do is if you go to your content browser, right-click in the empty space, go to miscellaneous, and add an OCIO color configuration. And we can call this OCIO TUT. Save that, open it up. We're going to go ahead and add a couple things. We're going to go ahead and add 2 of our desired color spaces. We'll set this first one to utility linear rec 709 and the index 1 to Aces CG. Now we have our desired display views. We're going to go ahead and add the plus a couple times. We're going to go ahead and add an sRGB display, Aces 1.0 SDR tone mapped. Under our index 1, we're going to set the second value, the index 1 for our desired display views, to Rec 1886 Rec 709 display. That's a mouthful. Set this to Aces SDR and then hit save. Now, my Unreal Engine viewport does look a little different because I was doing some tests. If I go to my lit mode up here, I see that I have this OCIO display turned on. By default, it will be turned off, and your viewport will probably look by default. This is just what Unreal Engine cooks up in the engine, in the game, etc. But if you're trying to do some more advanced things and you're rendering with EXRs, I do recommend working with your OCIO display, and we'll turn it on. We'll go to our OCIO and make sure that we set our OCIO to whichever one that we just created, or if you use my render presets, there's going to be one that's already built in, but we'll go to the TUT version, and it's going to give you a big scary error thing that we don't like. We're going to go to our none and set the first value to linear Rec 709, and then go to the second value and set this not to Aces CG, not that. We're going to set this to sRGB or Rec 709. This is dependent on where you want to render in post, whether you're working in Photoshop, After Effects, Vinci Resolve, etc. If you're rendering in sRGB, set it to sRGB. If you're delivering in Rec 709, Rec 709. I'll set this to Rec 709. That's my default. And if I know I'm going to be rendering EXRs, I will work in this color space and make sure that I do all of my lighting using this look instead of the default with no OCIO on. This does look different. It looks a little bit more saturated and colorful, kind of like a video game. For me, I typically have found that I like working in this slightly more desaturated look and doing some more color grading in post. But again, it really depends on what your workflow wants to be and what you need to do for your project. Now to check this, what I do recommend you do is go to your 3 bars up here, go to create a high resolution screenshot, and I'll set this value to like 2. The larger this number is, the more graphics intensive it will be to generate this screenshot, but we'll just go ahead and make sure that we are on frame 0, screenshot, and then we have our screenshot down here, and you'll just see that in this folder here. This is the last one that we just made with this name. So this screenshot, we're going to use this for reference in a second. Now, the last thing I will do when it comes to my more advanced render settings is I will go to my settings and I will add some console variables. And in the past, I used to add a ton of console variables, but Unreal looks pretty good as is. We can do a couple things to make it better, but it will increase your render time. So again, you have to really pick and choose like what's important, being fast with your render or trying to get the highest quality possible. And most of the time, these are like minuscule changes that are imperceptible to most people. So that being said, we'll go to our console variables, and the one I will always start with to help increase the overall quality is our screen percentage. So we'll type r.screen percentage, and very conveniently, Unreal 5.3 and onward has this little autofill, and I'll set the screen percentage to 150, and basically it's saying let's increase the size of our render by 150% and then scale it down to our target resolution. We're basically super sampling our image. The next console variable I'll add is plus here, and we'll type in r.motion blur quality, and I will go ahead and set this to a value of 4, and this is going to give me the highest quality motion blur for my render. Now the last thing I will do is I will go to r.depth of field quality, and I will set this value to a value of 4 as well. And if you're ever confused about these console variables, what you can do is go to your console command in the lower bar of your Unreal Engine window and type r. Let's just do depth of field quality, and instead of typing a number, we'll type question mark, and then we hit the tilde key, and this will basically give us a quick little preview of what the console command does. So 4 is extremely high quality. It's very slow, so this will take a lot longer to render, but if you want the highest quality possible out of your render, these are the settings that I use. And if you need to do more advanced things like crypto mats, like I said, let's set the compression to PIS, and then we need to make sure that we go to our settings, plugins, go to our crypto mats, and make sure that this plugin is enabled. We're not going to do it in today's tutorial, but make sure that you have movie render queue additional render passes enabled. And then when you do that, go to your settings, add your object IDs, and set this to however IDs however type of IDs you want, whether it's materials, actors, etc. We're not doing this because it's going to be huge files, so I'll delete that and then set my EXR sequence to DWA or DWAB, whatever you're feeling. Go ahead and set an output directory, set that, hit accept, hit render, and then you're going to see this. You can see our warm-up is already cooking, and once it kicks off, it's going to take a lot longer. This is about a 10-minute render versus the 2-minute render that we were doing previously, because we're doing a lot more in post to try and amp up the quality of our frame. I'm gonna let this finish, and then we'll jump into DaVinci Resolve and preview all of our renders.
One eternity later.
So we're in DaVinci Resolve, and I have all of my renders in my sequence. We have the JPEG render, and if I go ahead and zoom out and frame up my shot, looks fine. Looks cool. I also rendered out a PNG sequence, and it also, again, looks fine. They're pretty much imperceptibly different. If I go to this frame, if I go to this frame, awesome. JPEGs and PNGs will work fine, and 95% of the time, what you see is what you get, works good. However, I will add that if you add some temporal counts to your render, you will see a little bit of a difference and an improvement in quality. So if I go to my basic 1:8 settings, which is my temporals and sample counts, I can go ahead and see that there's a little bit of a difference. If I scroll in really close, I can see here that it looks like a zoomed in image. But if I go to my other frame, we can see that this zoomed in image looks really, really gross compared to my other image. Let's go to my color page really quick, and I can preview this more easily. If I click on this third clip, much cleaner versus kind of gross. So using 8 samples in your temporal sample count will really help with your render. Okay, so 95% of the time, what you see is what you get is a good motto to live by when rendering in Unreal. Now, we have our EXR sequence. Let's go ahead and frame up our render, and by default, when you import an EXR image into DaVinci using the default color management settings, YRGB, etc., it is going to look like this. It's going to look super dark and contrasty and gross. We could hit Alt-S and maybe try and decrease the contrast to get our image back, but it's just not going to give us the result that we want. So when you render with the more advanced render settings, you want to go to your ACES transform under your effects, drop this in, and then we're going to set our input transform. Scroll all the way down to the bottom and set this to sRGB linear. And then we're going to set the output to whatever we want to render in post. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find Rec 709 because that's typically my default. And that's going to look much more like the original image. It will look different to the PNG sequences that we rendered without any of our OCIO, color transformation, etc. But what I care most about is that my Unreal Engine viewport matches what I see in DaVinci Resolve. So let's go back to our lit mode, go to our OCIO display, make sure this is enabled, and we can see that we're using our linear Rec 709 and then converting to a Rec 709 display. And this looks like kind of flat and washed out, but we can fix some of this in post. I'm going to go back to DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to go to my timeline, and I have my scene linear screenshot right here. If I double click that, that's what it looks like. And what I care most about is that this looks exactly like my render. If I drop that on, scroll out, let's just go ahead and fit right here. And I turn this off and on. I can barely see a difference except for the little jaggedies of a just general Unreal screenshot. I will also say that when I go ahead and set my screenshot compositing mode to a value of difference, most of the values are black with the exception of the little weird issues that you get from an Unreal Engine screenshot. What the difference mode does is it basically makes any image or any pixel that is below or behind the object or layer that has the difference mode, if those pixels are identical, it will set the image to black. So when I set my screen linear to Rec 709 screenshot from Unreal on top of my EXR sequence, if I set that to difference, most of my image is black here. So we can say very confidently that our background pixels are exactly the same or within an imperceptible difference. And the reason why we're getting these jaggy edges around the silhouette of our grenade here is because when we do a screenshot in Unreal, we don't get to render with additional samples with the screenshot. We're just taking whatever the viewport can display. So it's a lower resolution image and we don't get samples. But I can say very confidently that most of these colors for the screenshot and the EXR sequence are pretty much identical, or at least for my colorblind eyes, they are as close as I can see them. So if you are using the more advanced render workflows in Unreal, I do recommend exploring working in an sRGB or Rec 709 color space and exporting in that sense. But if you're making games, you can pretty much ignore a lot of this stuff unless your art director tells you otherwise. This is what I have found works best for a lot of my client work. And that being said, most of my client work is making motion graphics and short films and cinematics and stuff. So that being said, if you want to render with more advanced render settings using EXRs and do color grading, etc., make sure you disable the tone curve. Make sure that you're working in a display view that corresponds to your output render, and that you go to your color tab and you make sure that under your EXR sequence, you set your input transform to linear if you're using the disabled tone curve, and you set your output transform to Rec 709 or to sRGB, which will give you something closer to what this PNG render will look like. So, all that is to say, most of the time, what you see is what you get in Unreal. Rendering with 8-bit PNGs, straight out of camera, straight out of Unreal will look good, and you can go ahead and add any post effects if you want to. But that is basically all of my render settings. If this was long-winded, complex, confusing, etc., linked in the description down below are my render presets. And if you learned something from this tutorial, I would love to hear about that in the comment section down below. That's what the comment section is for. And I will leave it here with this long-winded tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will leave you with the final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. You'll make some gains. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.